Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So in the last tutorial, which I entitled Unify Protect Camera API, I introduced an application that stores multiple snapshot images to a web server upon a motion event. And this is an example of that web server page. At the top bar here, you can see that I have one single camera device, which is called front door. And then below that, we have a series of timestamps, and each timestamp represents a single capture event. At the bottom of the screen, and it's a little difficult to see, I'm capturing 8 frames for each motion event, and currently frame number 7 is the one highlighted, and that's the one being displayed in this snapshot. So what is the application flow for this? Well, motion is detected by a motion detector. In the last video, I was a little bit more complex because I used the camera itself and an API in order to detect actual motion. This time, I'm just going to use a standard motion detector for simplicity. Secondly, when motion is detected, that triggers a rule machine rule on a habitat elevation hub to execute a capture event call. And yes, this is a habitat application, although the web server that we create is completely separate from the habitat. So the capture event device is of type camera motion capture, or CMC for short, and that is a custom device driver that makes repetitive calls to a camera motion capture web server. And then the CMC device knows the address of the web server, the snapshot URL for the camera, and it also knows how many snapshots are requested for each capture event that is initiated. And then the web server stores each set of snapshots for a camera as a time-stamped event. And the user interface on the web server allows the end user to watch each event by clicking on its timestamp. So what we're going to configure in this video is, first of all, we're going to build the CMC web server in an Incus container. It could just as easily be built in a virtual machine or even on a bare metal machine like perhaps a Raspberry Pi. And then secondly, we're going to create a parent and child CMC custom device driver, and we're going to add that to the habitat elevation hub. And then thirdly, the CMC parent device is going to be created from that device driver and configured with the address of the CMC web server. And then a CMC child device is going to be created and configured with the snapshot URL of the target camera and the number of snapshots required for a snapshot event. And you can actually create multiple CMC child devices if you have multiple cameras. And then a habitat rule machine rule is created that is triggered upon a motion event that makes a capture event call to the CMC child device. And finally, motion events are now stored as a group of timestamp snapshots on the CMC web server. So let's go see how we can configure all of this. Here we are on my Incus demonstration server, and I'm going to begin by creating an Incus container called CMC for camera motion capture. And this particular server I'm creating on my VLAN 30, which happens to be my VLAN where my cameras are located. And in your case, that may be different, but you'll want to expose that to an address where the cameras can see the server. Next, we want to move inside of the container with an Incus shell to CMC, And as soon as you create a new container, the very first thing you want to do is apply all of the updates. And we're doing that with an apt update & apt upgrade -y. Now that our new container is updated, the best practice is to always create a username. So I'm going to say add user Scott. I'll go ahead and give Scott a password, and I'll verify that password. And then I'm going to put Scott into the sudo group with the user mod -a G sudo Scott, and then we're going to switch user over to Scott. Now that I'm logged into the Scott account, I'm going to install some dependencies for our web server. To begin with, we're installing the Apache web server. We're installing Git because we're going to get the project for this web server from GitHub. The web server requires PHP, and then I'm making the lib Apache 2 module for PHP, which integrates PHP with Apache. I'm adding net-tools and open SSH server so that I can SSH into the server later on for maintenance purposes. Now that all the web server dependencies are installed, one of the things that I always like to do, even though it normally is done, is to do a sudo a2enmod on PHP 8.3. PHP 8.3 is the version of PHP that is in Ubuntu 24.04, and you see here that it says it's already enabled. You can always do a PHP-V to see the version of PHP that you are running. The next thing that we want to do is move over to the web root, and the web root for Apache is /var/www/html. The GitHub project that we're going to be using for this application is Michael Barone's Capture Motion Capture project, and I worked with Michael about 5 years ago in developing this project. And I provided some input, and he basically customized the application. As you can see, it basically dates from 5 years ago, but it's very stable because it's just a simple web server. And it basically says that it's called Camera Motion Capture, or CMC for short, and it saves images from IP cameras when motion is triggered in a post. And that is a web post command. And then Habitat drivers are located in this particular location. We're going to go ahead and provide those drivers in the show notes. And then it says that each camera is a virtual device which can trigger the image capture event, and it creates an iframe to add the CMC web interface to Habitat dashboards as well. Now that we're located in the web root, we're going to do a git clone on Michael Barone's CMC project to load the files into the web root. Web servers are particularly picky about the ownership of their files, and so we're going to go ahead and do a chown or change ownership of all of these files in the web root to www-data, which is the owner of the web server. We are also going to set the permissions on the directory folders with this command. And finally, we're going to set the permissions on the files inside of those folders with this command. Now that the files inside of the web server are properly set up, it's important to restart the Apache service with a sudo systemctl restart Apache 2. Now that the web server is configured, I'll do an ifconfig command to find out the address of device ETH0, and you can see here that it is 192.168.30.129. To access our new web server, I'm going to http:// the address I just found, 192.168.30.129 / camera motion capture with the first letter of each word capitalized. And then I go ahead and hit enter, and it accesses that web server. Now, right now, that looks completely black, but you can see this sort of gray line at the top, which will be where the camera names are stored. And then below that, there will be the timestamps, and then the big section will actually show the camera snapshots once we begin to use the web server. Head over to your Habitat Elevation web server interface, and once you're there, go down to driver's code. In driver's code, go ahead and say add a driver. And when you get to the screen to add a driver, we're going to paste in the code for the parent, which will be in the show notes. Once you do that, you can go ahead and click save. I'm not going to do that since I already have the driver installed on my system. Next, we have to add the child driver, and we're going to go ahead and click Add Driver once again under the driver's code section. And from the show notes, we're going to go ahead and paste in the code for the child device. And this is the camera motion capture child. Once again, you're going to come up in the upper right-hand corner and click Save, but I'm not going to do that since I already have the drivers installed on my Habitat. Once you've completed installing both the parent and the child driver, in the list of drivers code, you should be able to see a camera motion capture driver of type actuator, and you should see a camera motion capture child. The camera motion capture is what we refer to as the parent, and the camera motion capture child is what we refer to as the child driver. Now that the new device drivers are loaded, let's head up to the devices section at the top here. Once we click on devices, we're going to click add devices or add a device. When you add a device, we're going to click on virtual, and then when it says select device type, I'm going to type in camera. And then I'm going to scroll down here, and under the user area, they have a camera motion capture and a camera motion capture child. I want to choose the camera motion capture. I click next, and I'm going to give my application a name. In this particular case, I'm going to say demo camera snapshot, just to call it something. And now that I've got that, I'll go ahead and click next, and then I can skip putting it in a room. And at this point, I can go back to devices, and then I'm going to type in demo here. And when I type in demo, it'll bring me to the demo camera snapshot. Here, I want to go ahead and click the name of it. I want to go over to preferences, and here we want to input the web server URL for the web server that we just created. So in my case, that value is going to be http://192.168.30.129. And as the example shows above, we want to have camera motion capture / with the proper capitalization as shown. The next thing we want to look at is the capture frame count, and you can have as many frames captured as you want. I'll go ahead and set this to 6 frames, and finally the delay between frames, and in my case I want a 1 second delay between each snapshot that's taken. If all of your cameras have a particular username and password, you can go ahead and enter that in this field. At this point, we can go ahead and click Save and Close, and that'll go ahead and close it. and go back to this screen. Let's go back into the demo camera snapshot device, which is the parent, and this parent currently has no children, and that's probably a good thing because we don't want children driving. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and type the name of our first camera, and I'll go ahead and call this front door. And then I'll click run, and at that point it goes ahead and says command submitted very quickly in the top menu. I can exit this, and that we don't see anything any different here, we'll go ahead and do a refresh of this web page. When the refresh completes, we're going to see that there's a caret next to the parent demo camera snapshot. If we click on that caret, it shows an indented child device, which is the camera motion capture child, and it's called CMC front door. We want to go ahead and click on that CMC front door child, and then we want to go ahead and click preferences. Under the preferences area, that's where you want to put the snapshot URL for the camera that we're interested in, and that's going to differ according to the manufacturer of camera that you have. In the last video, we talked about how to access the Unify Protect camera API to get the snapshot URL offered from a proxy server, but I also identified the URL used for Reolink cameras. If you have a different camera, you should be able to look up that camera's documentation to find out what that snapshot URL was. Although it seems somewhat redundant, here it asks for the capture frame count again. Remember, we specified that in the parent. If we don't put anything special in here, it will go ahead and use the default offered by the parent. And the same is true of the delay between frames. So I'll just go ahead and leave those blank, and that will inherit the capture frame count of 6 from the parent and the delay between frames as 1 second between each snapshot. I'll go ahead and click Save and Close. One more thing worth mentioning is if we go back into the CMC front door, which is the child, we can go over to Preferences, and something else listed in the preferences here is the username and password for the camera if your camera requires a username and password. And likewise, up at the parent, there is also a username and password, and if it's filled in up there, that would be considered a master username and password for all cameras, whereas if we set it in the child, that will specifically override it just for that particular child camera setting. Next, head down to Apps, and once you're on the Apps page, go ahead and click Add Built-in Application. Scroll down in this list and find the application that's called Rule Machine. Go ahead and click on Rule Machine, and at this point it will enter this option to create a new rule, and I already have Rule Machine installed, and so I won't need to do that specifically. But if you don't have Rule Machine installed, you'll need to do that. But in any case, either way, you'll be creating a new rule. So I click on Create a New Rule, and the first thing it asks you to do is name your rule. I'm going to name my rule Demo Front Door Motion. And then I'll go ahead and click Continue. First thing you want to do is select a trigger event. Create a new trigger event by clicking the plus sign, and it asks for the capability for the new trigger event. In this particular case, I'm going to scroll down to where it says Motion. I'm going to click Motion Sensors, click to set, and I'll scroll down here, Motion Computer Room, Motion Outside Motion Detector. So I click outside motion detector, which is a motion detector that I have added to my habitat. I'm going to circle back and talk a little bit about motion detectors in a minute, but if you already have a motion detector, select it from this list and click Update. At this point, click Done with Trigger Event, and then click Done with Trigger Events. Now select Actions to Run, and when Actions to Run comes up, create New Action. When you create a new action, the first step you want to do is click this drop-down menu, and what we want is we want the option to set variable, mode, or file, or run custom action. In our particular case, we want to run a custom action, so we come over here to select which action and come down and click Run Custom Action. Under this section, it says Set Capability or Select Capability of Action Device, and we want to go down here and select Actuator. And if you'll recall, remember that both our parent and child drivers were driver types of actuator. So let's go ahead and click Select Actuators to run on. In this list of selecting actuators, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and find the one that is prefaced with CMC. And as it turns out, I have two, because one is for my production front door and the other is the one we created. So I'm going to pick the second one, which is the one we created, and I'm going to click Update. Over here where it says Select Custom Command, I'm going to click that pull down, and I'm going to say Capture Event. At this point, I'm done adding this action, so I'll click Done with Action. Now I click Done with Actions in the lower right, and it says that the demo front door motion is not installed, so I come down here and I click Install Rule. So now notice that the rule says that the trigger event is that motion is detected on the outside motion detector, and the actions to run are capture an event on the camera motion capture front door device, which points to the snapshot, and that goes ahead and stores to that snapshot server. So I just went outside and triggered a motion event on the front door or outside motion detector, and I'll just come up here to the web page and refresh it. Once I refresh it, you can see that I have my first motion event. It timestamps it as June 9th of 2025 and at 12:48 p.m. And here you can see that it is storing all 6 frames as indicated at the bottom of the screen. And you can see me walking out on the porch, and it will sit there and circularly show all 6 frames from the motion event. Once the first motion event is triggered, subsequent motion events will automatically be added to the web server and update the web page. And here you can see I didn't refresh the web page, nor did I go over and click, and yet it went over to the 12:51 p.m. event, and you can see me walking out the door and down the sidewalk. I wanted to circle back and discuss a little bit about what it takes to detect motion. So a lot of cameras, like this Reolink camera that you see here, will let you define a motion detection zone. And really for a fairly long time, I used to use the motion detection zone of cameras until I discovered things like blowing leaves, moving clouds, varying lighting outside, ends up being detected falsely as motion. So I stopped using cameras for motion detection. So that's changed pretty recently, and in my last video where we talk about using an AI camera such as the Unify Protect G6 turret camera, it does have AI capabilities that can recognize things like a car, a person, or an animal. So that's a little bit better, but I wouldn't use a standard camera with the motion detection zone as your motion detection. So in lieu of that, what I was using in this video was this Philips Hue motion sensor, and it is an outdoor motion sensor. It does not require you to have any other Philips Hue devices. It is a Zigbee device, I believe, and you can usually find it pretty readily out there, and it usually sells for right around $40 or $50. It's a pretty pricey device, but it is really great because it has a very fast refresh cycle, which means that it can detect motion and then very quickly detect motion again. Another device that I like to do motion detection is this EcoLink Z-Wave PIR motion detector, and this one is pet sensitive, where it has a setting that won't detect your pets, which is great because if you want to use it for security, then you're not constantly getting pictures of your pets when they move about, although you may want to do that. And this one is also pretty good. So if you use one of those motion detectors, then things work out pretty well. So if you buy one of these devices, then you don't want to go out and install the device according to the manufacturer's software program they have. For example, with the Philips Hue, you don't want to go out and just add this to the Philips Hue program, especially if you're not using the other Philips Hue devices. Instead, you can go ahead and pair this thing directly in Habitat. To do so, you just simply do an add device. You have to look at the documentation for the device and find out whether it was a Zigbee or a Z-Wave device. If you click on the Zigbee, it'll go ahead and allow you to start Zigbee pairing. You have to read the documentation on the device that you buy to understand how to put it into Zigbee pairing mode if it is a Zigbee device. On the other side of things, if it is a Z-Wave device, then Z-Wave performs an operation known as Z-Wave inclusion. And so you'll have to read your manufacturer's manual to find out how to do Z-Wave inclusion. Both the Philips device and the EcoLink device that I mentioned previously here both have device drivers that are a part of the Habitat system. So in summary, the CMC web server stores each motion event as a series of still frame camera shots. And the CMC parent and child devices on the Habitat define the CMC web server address and the snapshot URL for the camera. And many child devices can be created to support multiple cameras. And each camera stores its snapshot motion events under a separate tab on the web server. And just to be clear, the web server is where all of this data is stored, and it is completely independent from the Habitat itself. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.